All right. Welcome, everybody, to COVID-19, how it's changed us. I can't see you, but I see that we do have several guests here, and I really appreciate your coming. I think you'll really enjoy this conversation with these two very, very smart and interesting men. So I'm going to let them tell us about themselves, but first I will briefly introduce both of them. Let's start with the author of Apollo's Arrow, the profound and enduring impact of coronavirus on the way we live. His name is Dr. Nicholas Christakis. He's an MD, a PhD, an MPH, a Sterling Professor of Social and Natural Science at Yale University. We are also joined by the author of The Plague Cycle, The Unending War Between Humanity and Infectious Disease. Charles Kenny is a senior fellow at the Center for Global Development, and before that he was a senior economist at the World Bank, where he traveled the planet from Baghdad to Kabul to Brasilia to Beijing. He's written 2 previous books about global progress, and he will tell us more about the work that he does. Thank you, gentlemen, both, for joining us.
Thanks. Thank you for having us.
All right, let's start with Dr. Christakis. Tell us about yourself, what you do, why you do it, and your book.
I wasn't expecting to do the autobiography part. I'll just briefly mention that I am a physician. As Bonnie mentioned, I was a hospice doctor taking care of people who were dying, and I saw patients until about 10 or 15 years ago when I stopped being clinically active. And I do research. I have a research laboratory at Yale, and we study social networks. We study human social interactions, the evolutionary origin of these interactions. For example, why do we have friends at all? It's actually kind of unusual. Other animals don't form long-term non-reproductive unions with other members of their species, but we do. And this unusual practice of forming social networks, of living socially in the particular way that we do, actually places us at risk for epidemics. Because if we lived as isolated individuals, we wouldn't be subject to contagious disease. And actually, one of the arguments that I like to make is we come together to live with each other to reap certain advantages from an evolutionary point of view. For example, the capacity to teach and learn from each other, this fact that we are cultural animals. But to reap those advantages, we expose ourselves to certain risks. And one of the arguments that I make is that in a very real way, the spread of germs is the price we pay for the spread of ideas. That I come near you in order to learn from you or to share knowledge with you. And the way evolution has shaped our social networks to optimize that, the capacity for social learning, had to be counterbalanced with the risk of the spread of, the epidemic spread of pathogens. So that's the little bit of the work, just a quick feel for like my background, my entry into this topic. And maybe instead of summarizing the book, I'll just tell a little bit about why I wrote it, and then pick one sort of overarching idea of the book, which I know also intersects with Charles's perspective on this topic. I had been studying the spread of things in social networks for quite a long time, the spread of emotions, the spread of money, the spread of ideas, the spread of germs, the spread of behaviors, and so on. And I had been working with some Chinese collaborators over the years to use phone data in China describing people's social interactions to study the impact upon social interactions of certain developments. For example, an earthquake. If there's a massive earthquake, how does that reshape people's social interactions? And when the pandemic struck, we began to think about how we could use our data to understand the spread of the epidemic. And so we had data on 11 million people transiting through Wuhan in China in January of 2020. And we were able to use these data to build a model to accurately describe the early days of the pandemic. As people spread out from Wuhan throughout the rest of China and actually around the world, how did the epidemic spread? And so as a result of this, I was already in January paying very careful attention to the pandemic. And because we had these phone traces, we could look at people moving because of their cell phones in China. I was able to see with my co-authors that as of January the 25th, all motion in China ceased. And this really got my attention because on that date, the Chinese saw in the virus a threat of sufficient magnitude that they saw fit to basically detonate a social nuclear weapon to stop it. That's how bad they thought. They put 1 billion people in lockdown on January the 25th. This really got my attention, and I was, corresponding with a lot of epidemiology colleagues of mine, and everyone was very worried about this being a pandemic. But in the public sphere, our leaders, our politicians, were not saying anything to this effect. And then in February, Italy collapsed, in Lombardy, in northern Italy, and again, people were sort of lackadaisical, I thought. And so in March, I thought, my fellow citizens don't have any sense of what's about to hit them, and what can I do to help? And so I thought I would write a book that would describe some basics about epidemiology, but also position what we were experiencing in a great sweep of history. So that's what the book attempts to do. We're experiencing a once in a half century, once in a century event. Something very unusual has happened to us in our species. A new pathogen has been introduced into our midst, and it will now circulate among us forever. And this pathogen is having what is known in evolutionary biology, it's having what is known as an ecological release. It's like an invasive species, that, like a rat that we release on an island and it overruns the place. Our bodies are that island to the virus, which is the rat. And it's just going to spread and spread among us now indefinitely. But one of the things I try to highlight in the book is that while the way we have come to live right now seems so alien and unnatural to so many people, so strange, it's crucial to understand that plagues are not new to our species. They're just new to us. We think this is crazy how we've had to come to live. But if you look at written accounts, or if you look at archaeological evidence about dead bodies for thousands of years, it's very clear that this type of threat has been longstanding. And in fact, our responses to the threat, and then I'll shut up, I'll say one more thing, are stereotypic. So all the things that we see right now, the grief-making power of plagues, the fact that plagues take our lives, take our livelihoods, take our way of life. It's a time of loss, and people are sad. The blame, the fact that we seek to blame others, is typical. In medieval times, it was the Jews' fault. With HIV, it's, homosexuals or Haitians or IV drug users. Always we seek to blame someone else when it's just a pathogen that's killing us mortals. The death of healthcare workers. Thucydides in the Plague of Athens talks about how all the doctors were dying. Pope Clement VI during the bubonic plague in the 1340s talks about how all the nurses were dying. This is also typical. The fear that we see, the lies, the spread of rumors and superstition and mendacity, typical of plague. If you think of plague as one of the 4 horsemen of the apocalypse, which it is, right behind the virus spreading are lies. So you can think of mendacity as the horseman's squire, and so through the social networks, the germs are spreading, and through the social networks, misinformation and also truth is spreading. And in a sense, it's these dueling contagions spreading on social networks of biological contagion and social contagions about proper behaviors, let's say, that are competing to see, who will win in a sense. I think I will I'll stop there, except I'll read, because I didn't highlight it. I mentioned all the bad things that plagues do to us, but they also elicit from humans some wonderful properties of cooperation and teaching. We are, as a world, banding together to confront this collective threat. We are working together to implement social distancing. We are working together to invent and distribute vaccines. These are wonderful qualities that our species has and should be seen as counterforces to some of the worst qualities I mentioned a moment ago. And therefore, I was very taken by a famous passage from Albert Camus' The Plague, which features as its protagonist a physician. And this is set in North Africa in the 1940s, but it's based on outbreaks in a bubonic plague in the prior century. And this is the passage that I'll close with. It says, Dr. Rieu, he's the protagonist of Camus' book, The Plague, Dr. Rieu resolved to compile this chronicle so that some memorial of the injustice and outrage done them might endure, and to state quite simply what we learn in time of pestilence, that there are more things to admire in men and women than to despise. And that's very much how I feel about life in general, that there's more to admire in people than to despise, even in times of plague. Thank you.
Thank you very much. Yes, very much so. That's been my experience. Before I toss it to Charles, I do want to say that welcome to the San Antonio Book Festival, which I did not do, supported by Nowhere Bookshop, which is a reasonably new local bookshop here in San Antonio. And please, please buy your copies of Dr. Christakis and Charles Kennedy's books there. Please do that. That would be fantastic, and you need to read them. Now, Charles, you deal with a lot of the same themes that Dr. Christakis just talked about, but through a different lens. So tell us about that. And tell us about yourself.
Oh, thank you, and thank you for having me. And actually, I want to start with a few more thank yous. On Monday, I got my first jab. Maryland's a little behind, I gather, Texas, but still, it started. And the vaccine was injected by a woman, a nurse who was born in Vietnam. The technology that underlies it was developed by a Turkish migrant and somebody whose parents were Turkish migrants living in Germany. The company that produces it was run by a Greek immigrant to the United States, and actually a Hungarian immigrant to the United States developed the underlying technology for the mRNA vaccines. And it speaks to exactly what Nicholas was talking about, that yes, it is true, a dense and globally connected world means we're more exposed to pathogens and they spread faster. Mm-hmm. At the same time, our sort of best defense against that is the fact that we live in a dense and globally connected world. And, you know, people coming together is how we're going to solve this one, not any attempt to sort of move backwards through vaccine nationalism and sticking up border walls. That simply, you know, won't work in the modern world. And to some extent, you know, that was why I started writing the book. And I should say, unlike Nicholas, and I'm immensely impressed how fast he wrote. It took me sort of closer on 5 years to do research for this book. I started from way behind Nicholas. I'm not a medical doctor, so there was a lot more I had to learn, I guess. And the reason was I've been writing these books on global progress, and sort of the most obvious and perhaps uncontrovertible fact about how the world has got better over the last few decades is to look at what has happened to child mortality. If you go back to the 1960s, the average parent worldwide would expect one of their children to die before the age of 5. They'd expect to be burying a child. And now worldwide, that is thankfully a comparatively rare experience, partially because child mortality rates are, you know, much less than a fifth of what they were a few decades ago, and, you know, much less than a tenth of what they were a century or so ago. And I sort of wanted to look into the underlying reasons why, and quickly discovered that since, you know, fantastic tomes like McNeil's Plagues and Peoples, a book I still strongly recommend, and Zinska's Rats, Lice and People.
I plan to bring that book up during my questions because I read it in college. Yeah,
it's still a fantastic book. I think, you know, still, and Nicholas can give a perhaps more informed answer, but I think still right on most of the medical aspects, and still certainly right on much of the broader history. But there had been a lot of sort of new research, not just on the medical aspects, you know, and again, I'm an economist and a historian and not a medical doctor, but a lot more on the sort of knock-on effects in terms of how societies looked and economic responses since then. And so I wanted to get that across. I mean, sort of the impacts on women's equality, you know, forget the huge impacts on overall economic performance, the impact on women's equality, on gay and lesbian rights, on violence. I think we underestimate how much the world has changed because infection has receded so much from where it was. All of that before COVID, and I should say, I think I deserve credit, if you will, for being one amongst another, a number, and Nicholas obviously too, who thought that there was probably going to be at some point another global pandemic, in a way that was fairly obvious because of SARS and Nipah, and we'd had a lot of close calls before. The thing that really made me have to do some more writing during the last year was how much I underestimated the impact of this pandemic. I was quoting economists and others who had made estimates of how much a global pandemic on the scale of the 1918 flu, how much economic damage it would do, and the numbers they were coming up with were 3 trillion. Well, we've blown through that multiple times, and so I think there was, and I had a widespread sense that this could happen. I underestimated how bad it could be, and I'm afraid part of the reason I think many of us underestimated how bad it could be is because we overestimated how well we'd do in response. We've done fantastically on rolling out a vaccine program, within a year of the emergence of COVID-19. Beats all previous records, and it's wonderful. However, we did terribly on all of the things before that, pretty much on controlling the outbreak at source, at putting in place testing and tracing systems that could keep it under control. Some honorable mentions aside: Taiwan, South Korea, New Zealand, China. But largely we did terribly in that. We did terribly in enforcing mask mandates. We were late in social distancing and so on and so forth. So, perhaps one of the reasons that we all, or some of us at least, underestimated how bad this could get is because we overestimated how much we should have learned, or overestimated how much we did learn from previous pandemics. We've known about the impact of masking and social distancing and so on for at least 100 years. There was a lot of discussion of it in 1918, and I guess there was the hope we'd learnt our lesson, and perhaps not. And that is, somewhat of a worry going forward. Are we going to forget the lessons of this pandemic too? I sincerely hope not. But that's sort of where the book came from, and where it ends too.
Yes. And obviously these are, I think, both primers that everybody should really read to sort of, so we're all conversant in the same language and context and history. It will certainly help us make better decisions going forward. So let's specifically talk about these specific books. Dr. Christakis, Apollo's Arrow. Tell us where that title comes from.
It's from the Iliad, of course. I mean, one of the things that I wanted to say, I said earlier, plagues are not new to our species; they're just new to us. And you can see that because they're in the Bible, they're in the Iliad, they're in Cervantes, they're in Shakespeare. We think it's so crazy that we have to face a plague, but our ancestors have been facing them for thousands of years. And so the Apollo's Arrow refers to the opening lines of the Iliad, which is a magnificent book I reread every few years. Just as an aside, when you're a young person, you think that the book is about Achilles and the Greeks, but really the only hero in the book is Hector, and it's just extraordinary, actually. Anyway, the book opens as follows. The Greeks were laying siege. So Apollo is the god of many things. He's the god of healing and also the god of plagues. And this is typical of many ancient religions, where the same god was the bringer of disease and the bringer of wellness. And the Greeks were encircling Troy and had laid siege to Troy, and periodically would go on these raids and they would sack vassal Troy's. So they had sacked a city not far from Troy. They had killed all the men. They had taken all the booty, and they had brought the women back to their camp, basically as slaves, including a maiden girl, Chryseis was her name, who was the daughter of Chryses, a priest of Apollo in the sacked city. Somehow Chryses survived this sacking. I don't know how exactly, but he comes to the Greek camp and he goes to the the tent of Agamemnon, the leader of all the Greeks, and he falls onto his knees, and he's brought a great ransom, and he asks to ransom his daughter. And not only does Agamemnon, who had been assigned this young woman as part of his treasure, refuse, but he abuses this man, the priest. And he says to him, he smacks him, and he says, not only will I not surrender your daughter, but she will grow old in my house, tending my loom, in my bed. And he's very abusive to the priest in a way that the Greek soldiers do not like. So the priest goes down to the shore and he says, oh, dear God Apollo, listen to me. If you have ever smelt or appreciated my offerings over the years, hear me now, punish the Greeks. And Apollo on Olympus immediately hears his prayer and is enraged and takes his great silver bow, because like many ancient religions, the Greeks had this sense that that Apollo would fling these unseen arrows, and these arrows would, were disease in a way not too dissimilar than the unseen germs, that spread. And Apollo flies down from Mount Olympus and lands among the boats, the Greek boats, and crouches among the boats. And the poem goes, first he killed the running dogs, then the horses, then the men. 9 days through the army go the arrows of the god, until on the 10th day, Hera, the queen of the gods, took pity on the Greeks, for she saw them perishing, because great numbers of Greeks were dying in huge funeral pyres. Anyway, that's the beginning of one of the canonical works of the Western canon, and it starts with a plague, and that's why the book is called Apollo's Arrow.
I love it. Thank you. Let's talk about, we know what a plague cycle is, or we can talk more about plague cycles further in the conversation, but I was struck by your cover art. So tell us about that and where it came from, Charles Kenny.
So it's a picture of death at work, if you will, with his scythe. Beautiful drawing. It draws from the cover of a French newspaper from 1911, and it's death in Manchuria. Manchuria at the time was suffering under a pneumonic plague, a bit like the bubonic plague, only spread through the air as well. I thought it was fantastic. I mean, I had nothing to do with the cover art, to be honest, but I thought it was a fantastic image, and it's actually it was a prescient, not prescient, but it was a very appropriate image for this year, because the response to the Manchurian plague put in place by Chinese doctors involved social distancing, it involved mask wearing, and it involved restrictions on travel. And there are arguments over how much this plague would have sort of disappeared without those interventions, but they were the interventions that the doctors tried, the public health officials tried at the time, and the plague fairly rapidly went away. And so here we are 109 years later, mucking up what they managed to do in one of the poorest parts of the world 109 years previously. And I do think it tells you something a bit depressing about our COVID response.
Yeah.
One of the things I would say is these primitive threats call for primitive measures. I mean, it is, it is miraculous that we live in a time where our time in the crucible, I think we're the first generation of humans alive who have been able in real time to manufacture a specific and effective countermeasure in the form of a vaccine. Now our ancestors thought they could do things like, in medieval times, if you, one of the prescriptions was you take a snake and you mince the snake up, and you mince up some onions and you make a paste of snake and onions and you rub it on your body, and this will ward off the plague. They thought they had specific things to do, but they didn't. And the tools at their disposal, therefore, were all the same tools that we have, which is to socially distance, to wear masks. That does not go, to my knowledge, does not go back hundreds of years, but certainly 100 years ago, as Charles just mentioned, in 1918 pandemic, there were big debates about mask wearing, same politicization, alas, as we've had now. Border closures have been considered for thousands of years, and so on. So this is a primitive threat, and we have to use primitive measures, although we are lucky that we also have more advanced measures in the form of these vaccines.
But just, Nicholas, on that, and it comes to plagues and peoples too, Bonnie, which you said you wanted to mention. Marco Polo, travels to China on his trade mission, if you will, and ends up at a banquet with the Chinese emperor, and all of the waiters are wearing masks, silken masks, apparently rather elegant ones, to stop their effluence affecting the quality of the food. So, it would be a bit hard to claim that that was sort of a strict public health measure, but that idea at least has been around for a long time. It is notable, and probably not caused by that, that one of the things that opinion has changed on somewhat since O'Neill's book is the idea that there was a serious outbreak of the Black Death in China. There's actually a fair amount of evidence that there wasn't much impact of the Black Death on China, nearly as much as there was in Europe. And sanitary measures may be one reason why. Chinese cities were much cleaner and much more dispersed than European cities at the time. As Nick has said, sort of we've had a lot of these basic approaches for so long, and we still need them, partially because for all we got a vaccine so far, there was still a gap. We still needed to test it, make sure it was safe, and that gap isn't going to go away immediately. So next time we need to do so much better at the old techniques that Nicholas was mentioning.
Yeah,
I should mention that this pathogen SARS-CoV-2 kills between 1 and 1.6% of the people that it infects and that get sick from it, and that's quite serious. Actually, it's about 10 times deadlier than the flu. But it's nowhere near as deadly as bubonic plague or smallpox or cholera, which were called the Trinity, the holy trinity of diseases in the subcontinent, in the Indian subcontinent. And but there's no God-given reason that this pathogen isn't worse. Just think about that. This particular virus that is afflicting us could have had all the same properties that it has, all the same intrinsic properties. Its communicability, its the symptoms that it causes, but had lethality that was 10 or 30 times worse. Like in the movie Contagion, the virus there kills about 30% of the people it infects. Just imagine what our world would be like, or our country would be like, in that situation. And this is why so many people, and why Charles has been thinking about this from his perspective, this is why so many people have rightly been considering pandemic disease to be a national security threat. Why as well I'm so ashamed of our response. And furthermore, unlike bacterial epidemics like bubonic plague or cholera, for which we have many effective antibiotics, because we can treat bacteria with antibiotics, for viruses, we have few, if any, treatments. So a virus that kills large numbers of people, which could emerge on its own accord, with its own whim, at any time, and wipe us out, we have nothing to do to stop it, except these ancient techniques of physical distancing, which we need to do better at, or now going into the future, the ability to develop vaccines, which nevertheless take time, which again mean we have to do these basic things, while we develop the vaccine. So, we are suffering as much as we have. Nevertheless, it could have been so much worse. And this is why so many people, again, Charles included, are so worried about this, because it could happen again. There's no reason in fact, it will happen again. It's only a question of when. We could have another global pandemic not in 50 years, but in 20 years, or at any time.
Or sooner, yeah.
And we should do better, I hope, the next time.
So I think that off topic of your books, but on topic of what you just said, part of the reason, though, this pandemic has been so deadly is that it is so survivable, right? People don't take it seriously, but it's genius. If viruses, were sentient, it would be genius that it is not so deadly that people really just stay home in terror.
If I might, let me just interject an epidemiological point, and then again, I'll shut up. You're absolutely right to highlight the intermediate lethality of this pathogen. It's sufficiently deadly that it harms us a lot, but not so deadly that people take it seriously. You're right. But there's a further wrinkle, which is subtle, which is the protean manifestations of this virus, Let me quickly give an example. Suppose you have one population of 1,000 people, 10 of them are infected with a virus and get seriously ill, and one of them dies. So that's a 10% fatality rate in that population. In another population, population B, again 1,000 people, again 10 are infected and one of them dies. 10 are infected and get seriously ill and one of them dies. But an additional 90 people get a mild course of illness. So 1 out of 100 people die, 1% fatality rate. Which world would you rather be in? Would you rather be in a world in which there's a 10% fatality rate, ostensibly, or a world in which there's a 1% fatality rate? Well, most people would say, I'd rather be in the world with 1% fatality. But that's wrong, actually. That world is a worse world because in addition to 10 serious illnesses and 1 death, you also have 90 mild illnesses in that world. And so this ability of the virus to not only cause serious illness, but also mild illness has muddied the waters. So many people don't take it seriously. So, my friend had the flu, had the sniffles, was asymptomatic. So it's not just the absolute lethality, it's the variety of disease that the pathogen causes. I think if it had made fewer people sick, but more uniformly killed them, we would be taking this virus more seriously.
Yeah, like SARS 1, 10%, and everybody took that very seriously. Dr. Charles, what do you have to add?
And interestingly, many of the countries that have done best against COVID are countries that had the SARS experience and put in place the sort of test and trace regimes necessary to keep it locked down. And so, I hope we all learn the lesson this time. I will say, despite the fact, compared to the plague that was killing, a third of European population, obviously, COVID is in the bush leagues. I think if you look at the economic impact of COVID-19, and maybe not up there with the plague, but it's definitely, massive. And it is partially just because we live in a much more connected world where, most people need to be together in order to produce stuff. So at the time of the Black Death in Europe, most people were living in small villages where actually, quite often spared the plague pretty much completely because there was so little contact with the outside world, and they were self-sufficient. They didn't need to go anywhere. They were working on feudal farms. Today, that doesn't work. I mean, luckily this disease came along when more people in some countries could work virtually, me included. But many people still need to do their work in places with other people, and they face this horrible choice of do I go to work and risk my life, or do I not go to work and not have any money? And so the economic effects of this pandemic, I think, have been some of the worst. And it's another lesson for next time that we need to look beyond just the medical response. We need to make sure that it is affordable for people to stay home. We need the safety nets in place, the broad safety nets in place, so that people don't have to face this choice between, risking death and risking starvation, if you will. I exaggerate, but only somewhat, in terms of the impact. And that has to be a global response. All of this has to be global. The vaccine distribution has to be global. The masking has to be global. The ability to help people stay home when they need to stay home in order to stay healthy needs to be global.
Yeah, but that's a big ask, I think, right? I mean, do you have ideas about how to do that?
It is a big ask, but if you look at the United States response, for example, it involved, checks to everybody. Pakistan hasn't managed to do it to everybody, but I think it's about 80% of the population has received payments. The numbers aren't too different in the Philippines. With mobile money payments, it is possible to do that part of it. Now, where does the money initially come from for very poor countries to do this? I would look to international institutions. If we learn anything from eradicating smallpox last century, it's that there's a massive benefit globally to eradicating a disease everywhere. Now Nicholas says we probably won't manage that with COVID-19, but we can certainly control it to such a level that it is sort of economically a bit of an irrelevance, but only if we do it globally, and that will be in everybody's economic interest. So I do think this is a case where rich countries ought to pony up in their self-interest in order to make sure that we can make this a global response.
And there are two kinds of self-interest. First of all, you could make the argument on moral grounds that it's the right thing to do for us to vaccinate the world. And I do think the rich countries, and now I include China, Japan, the EU, Russia, the United States, should band together to do these things, not only because it's the moral thing, Also, as Charles was emphasizing, it's economically in our interest. We need trading partners, but it's also epidemiologically in our interest, because we do not want countries around the world with unvaccinated populations, which basically serve as petri dishes for the emergence of new worrisome strains of the virus. It's in our interest to vaccinate the world. It's also in our interest to set up a global surveillance system, not just to detect these viruses and other pathogens, not just viruses, other classes of microbes that cause illness, not just to detect, them, not just for the benefit of those local situations, but to give us an early warning system, right? Like, we want to know if new worrisome strains of this virus are emerging in South America, because they will inevitably come to our shores. And now with the mRNA technology and the adenovirus technology, with 6 months warning, we could develop booster shots. So
Right.
There's a huge stake in all of this and in global cooperation to confront pandemic disease, just like climate change or nuclear war. These require a kind of global response, for better or worse.
And actually, just on that last one, COVID-19 is not a man-made disease, we don't think, but we do have a global treaty around man-made infection. The UN body that runs it has all of 5 people to monitor compliance with the Biological Weapons Convention, and I do think it would probably be worth, ramping up the capacity to monitor the threat of intentional, pandemics in the future, because again, not this time, but it may only be a matter of time.
Definitely. I'd like to remind everybody here that you can ask our authors questions. Just type them in the chat box, and I will share them so that you can learn what you want to learn. But I, since I'm opening it up to questions, want to ask you, Dr. Christakis, about a part of your book that was fascinating to me, like geeked out fascinating, which is the Russian flu and its possible relationship to, I have to look, OC43. Can you tell us about that?
So there was a worldwide pandemic in 1890 that has been thought to be caused by influenza, but there is a set of suggestive evidence that possibly that was a prior coronavirus, in fact, not influenza. There's some suggestive genetic evidence of this, and some clinical evidence and some epidemiological evidence that I review in the book. And the idea was there was a great culling of cattle back then, and there is some concern that the virus, which probably also began in bats but via cattle, spread to us, to humans, and then spread worldwide. It took 70 days to get from Moscow to New York on trains. It spread by trains through Europe and then by boats across the Atlantic and arrives in New York City 70 days later, and causes many of the same symptoms and many of the same economic collapse. People were wearing masks in 1890. There are all these, in fact, there were jokes about how you didn't need to wear masks. This was just a racket that the bandana sellers were trying to persuade you to sell their bandanas.
Big bandana.
Yeah,
it was
exactly.
Big bandana. Yeah.
Yeah, exactly. Exactly. Was out to get you.
Right.
And what happens, what typically is felt to happen or can happen, is that the interaction between a pathogen and a host is a kind of symbiotic relationship, or not symbiotic. That's not the right word. The pathogen and the host reach a kind of equilibrium over time, because the pathogen doesn't want to kill us from a Darwinian point of view. It would rather, a pathogen that kills you stops its ability to keep spreading. What the pathogen really wants to do is quote unquote wants to do, is to make you mildly ill, if ill at all, and you keep moving around and spread the infection to other people. And this is why generally, although not always, more benign versions of pathogens come to predominate over time compared to deadlier versions of pathogens. And so one of the theories about what may have happened in 1890 is that over the last century, this coronavirus was actually one of the 4 coronaviruses that causes the common cold, known as OC43. So when all of us get about 30% of common colds are caused by coronaviruses. There are 4 species of coronavirus that do this. One of those species, people think, or some people think, one of those species, the OC43 species, may be a distant echo of a serious global pandemic from 100 years ago. And I think there's a good chance that that is true. And I think that is the likely ultimate fate of the current coronavirus. It will become endemic. You will be exposed to it when you're a child. You will have, as we all know, a mild and not deadly illness as a child. You will develop some immunity to it. And then you will periodically be re-exposed into adulthood and get mild courses of illness because you had prior exposure that was not deadly, just like common cold. And actually, incidentally, some other diseases like chickenpox, for example. So anyway, I think that could be the case.
Yeah, and one of our viewers asked if we were going to let you talk about your books, but that is in your book. So we are currently talking about your books. So, so thank you for that. Loretta asked a question. I have to scroll here. Loretta asked for Dr. Christakis, as we move forward after vaccines and more of our lives continue to be spent in isolation through more online work and lingering fears related to COVID, should we take strong steps to regain the collective benefits of our social nature? What interventions will be needed?
I think life will return to normal, and I think that's the common theme, but both Charles and I are emphasizing that plagues have afflicted us for thousands of years, and life does eventually return to normal. You could be a little cynical about this. There's a joke that surgeons say, which is that all bleeding stops eventually.
Yeah. Mm-hmm.
All plagues end eventually. They do end, and this one will end, and life will return to normal. I think it's going to take a number of years for a variety of reasons we can discuss and that are discussed in the book for life to return to normal. And I do not think special procedures will be required to encourage us to regain a more social face-to-face nature. I mean, some changes are here to stay, like working from home, I think, and using this type of technology to communicate and so on. I think some of those technological changes will be permanent or quasi-permanent, but primarily I think we will return to normal life eventually.
Jane asks, could you, either one of you, hazard a guess as to when we will get back to some semblance of normal life?
It depends on how you define normal, but I think it's going to be a number of years. I think through the end of 2021, the beginning of 2022, despite our rollout of the vaccine, it's going to take time to vaccinate enough people or to have enough people be naturally exposed before we reach this important threshold known as herd immunity. When we reach that threshold, the epidemic force of the virus will be behind us. The virus will still be present. It won't be eradicated. It'll still kill us, but the kind of explosive epidemic capacity of the virus will be behind us. But then, like a tsunami that washes up a shore and devastates the landscape, the waters recede, but there's a lot of debris. And we as a society are going to have to clean up the debris. Between 500,000 and 1 million Americans will have died. Probably 5 times as many will be disabled. I'm not talking about long or short COVID. I'm talking about people who recover from the disease, but whose bodies have been harmed. That's 2.5 to 5 million Americans. So we'll have millions of Americans with disability, millions of Americans who've lost loved ones, millions of children who miss school, millions of Americans who lost their jobs, millions of businesses that have closed. Trillions of dollars will have been borrowed, and Charles can comment on the long-term economic impact of this printing of money. So all of that's going to take time to respond to, I think, till 2023 or beginning of 2024. And then I think we'll enter the post-pandemic period, which I think will be a little bit of a party, similar to the roaring 20s of the 20th century. We'll have a kind of roaring 20s. I think people will relentlessly seek out social opportunities in nightclubs and restaurants and bars and sporting events and political rallies and musical concerts. I think people will be liberal in spending their money. I think we'll see an efflorescence of the arts and of entrepreneurship and so on. And I think finally then we will have sort of put the plague behind us. And this coming summer, I think, will be a bit of a period like that too, but it's too early. I think this summer, because of rising vaccination and COVID fatigue, and it's the summer weather and people will be outside, which will mitigate transmission. I think we're going to have a bit of a better summer, but next winter we'll have another wave. Not as bad as last winter, I don't think. And all of this, and I'll shut up, all of this depends on the variant concerns, because if we have newly emergent variants that are much more deadly, or worst of all, evade the vaccine, then, you know, all bets are off on what I just said.
Charles, as an economist, Nicholas wanted you to talk about the printing of money. Talk about that printing of money, please, and then print some for me. More, please.
So I'm with Nicholas that things will go back to normal, and we pretty much know because they have so often in the past. You know, if you look at the worst year of the Black Death, England and France are halfway through the 100 Years' War at the time. They take kind of 6 months off fighting and then go straight back at it. You know, we just have a sort of, you know, natural ability to get on with things, if you will. And you know, people are talking about this being the end of cities. You know, if cities couldn't survive infection, you know, we wouldn't have them today. For the vast majority of history, cities were mass infectious killers with death rates far higher than rural areas. You know, that's no longer true. It will, you know, go back to being no longer true very soon. And you know, people like social. I mean, as Nicholas was talking about, you know, people want to go to bars, they want to go to restaurants. Where are the bars and the restaurants? They're in cities. So I think in that way the effect will be fairly muted. I'm somewhat worried. I'm sorry. The human cost already has been horrible, and I think the human cost will reverberate in a number of ways. Not least, as you may be able to tell, I wasn't born in the States. I came here from the UK. My wife is American. About 20% of the US married population is married to someone from elsewhere. Last year, that pretty much stopped, right? And then, or at least new additions pretty much stopped. And it's not just about sort of that kind of human interaction. It's about the fact that what drives innovation, what drives global progress is people coming together and having conversations these days. You know, and there weren't the academic conferences, there weren't the investors going off around the world to, you know, set up a company and all of that. And that effect, you know, could go on for a decade or two, the sort of a ripple effects of a year of pretty much shutting that down. And so, you know, in some ways, that's the economic effect I worry about most. The world has borrowed a lot of money. Actually, I think the developing world hasn't borrowed enough money, and I'd like to see, you know, a greater response from the International Monetary Fund and the World Bank to allow them to borrow more money. But you know, rich countries have borrowed a lot of money. Luckily, they've done it at really low interest rates. So you know, it was the right thing to do, and we may get away without paying too much for it. So you know, that I accept that that's a potential worry. But you know, to be frank, what I'm more worried about is the thing that has underpinned 2 centuries of global progress was taken away for a year, and that was people connecting.
So you have complicated thoughts about things like travel bans in your book, but Kathleen wants to know what you think about vaccination cards, and I'll extend that to like passports and that kind of thing.
My complicated thoughts, just to be brief, are that as a rule, the travel bans we introduced were too late to have much of an impact. The impact they mainly had was to pack a whole load of people into airports and have them wait in long lines in order to get into the country. And this is probably not what you want to do in the midst of a pandemic. When it comes to vaccine passports, I feel differently. I feel different, and you know, I have nuanced thoughts on travel bans. If I was New Zealand at the moment, for example, or Taiwan, I would at least want to have, you know, very strict quarantine in place like they do. I feel about vaccine passports a bit the same way. I don't think they're necessarily a great way to stop the spread of a disease. I think they may have some impact on encouraging people to get vaccinated. And people ought to get vaccinated. So in that way, I'm in favor of them. And it's hardly as if they're a new thing. I mean, I have, you know, sitting next to my passport, a yellow fever card that you need in order to cross a number of borders in the world today. You know, this is not a new idea. During the plague, you needed to get your doctor's permission in order to travel between Italian cities. You know, this idea has been around a long time. I don't think it's necessarily a great tool to prevent the transfer of disease by itself, but as a tool to encourage people to get vaccinated, I'm all in favor.
How about cards to get into businesses?
Yeah,
go ahead.
Yeah, there's nothing new about this. I mean, as Charles mentioned, I mean, journalists and just ordinary travelers have known about the necessity of these so-called WHO, these yellow cards that have been issued for decades. To go, and in fact, to immigrate into our country, we require new immigrants to have proof of vaccination of like 20 different communicable diseases. Basically, have to got every shot that is available if you want to immigrate permanently into our country. Many employers have vaccination as a condition of employment. You can't be in the healthcare business without getting vaccinated for the flu. I'm required every year to prove to my employer that I got a flu vaccine. It's not a choice. I don't have that choice. If you work in veterinary medicine, you need to get a rabies shot. It goes on and on. So there's really nothing at all unusual about requirements for vaccination. Whether we call it a vaccine passport or a vaccine card or whatever we want is irrelevant. In terms of private businesses, I think that private businesses, there are exceptions to this in terms of public accommodation. You can't discriminate against certain protected classes. You can't set up a business and say, I'm not going to serve people of a certain religion or a certain race, for example. But absent that, we need to allow business holders to make choices. And if I am a business holder and I say I want my employees to be vaccinated, partly because I don't want to be sued by my other employees who say I got sick at work and you didn't enforce a very prudent public health precaution, or my customers. I want my customers to feel safe. I think businesses should be allowed to make their own rules in this regard. And I've been greatly amused by Governor DeSantis and other Republican governors who, for years after extolling private property and private enterprise and the rights of businesses, now suddenly want to prohibit businesses from promulgating these own regulations. Finally, let me just the thing that's distinctive about communicable diseases is that my behavior imposed a risk on you. If I was to act in a self-injurious way, then you can make the argument that the state has no role in preventing me from acting foolishly and taking my own life. Of course not. But if my foolish behavior imposes a risk on others, then this is the canonical case in which state intervention is seen as justifiable. And this has been understood in American jurisprudence for 100 years. There are famous cases about mandated vaccination 100 years ago. And again, the courts ruled that public health authorities may implement a variety of constraints on individual liberty in the name of the common good, just like we conscript in times of war, right? What could be more, the state drafts you into the army and exposes you to a risk of death. Well, if we allow a state to do that when we feel like there's this external threat, surely we can allow a state to mandate vaccination, for example. So that's my perspective.
Just to pile on, most people can get the vaccine and should get the vaccine. There are, in the case of a number of vaccines, a small group that shouldn't because they have, suppressed immune systems for one reason or another. And if you, who could get the vaccine, choose not to get the vaccine, you are increasing their risk, and they have no choice to get the vaccine. You're increasing their risk of getting the disease. So you're having a really nasty and non-counterable effect on the quality of life of others. And so of course, I agree with Nicholas. Of course, the state has a role here. This is why we have states.
Yes, exactly.
Right, for sure. All right, so we've got about 7 more minutes left. So one more time, I'm going to say you can get these books by Dr. Christakis and Charles Kenny at the Nowhere Bookshop. There is a link on the event page. Also, you should listen to my podcast, which is, I'm going to give myself a shameless plug, Petrie Dish, Petrie Dish, from Texas Public Radio and NPR. So you can get that on NPR One, Spotify, Apple Podcasts, all the places. Okay, so as we leave I just got a question here. Janet, I will try to get to your question, but I first want to ask both these gentlemen to wrap up with the session title, which is COVID-19, How It's Changed Us. How do you think it's changed us? And we'll start with Charles Kenny.
I think it's made us all more lonely. The first thing to say is obviously it's killed a lot of people.
Right.
And as Nicholas is emphasizing, not only has it killed a lot of people, it's left a lot of people with permanent disability of one sort or another, and not just physical, but I think also mental. That this has been an absolutely disastrous year for millions of people one way or another, you know, losing loved ones, losing their jobs, you know, housing and so on. I mean, livelihoods. Just, you know, that's the way it's had its worst effect. But I think, you know, for all of us who were lucky enough not to have experienced any of that directly or sort of in our immediate families, loneliness, I think, would be the big thing it's caused. And I don't think we can underestimate how bad that is for a social species. You know, it is bad, you know, bad to our very core, if you will. And as I've said before, I think it's really bad for sort of the global economy and global society, because what has led to 200 years of immense economic and social progress, you know, life expectancies going from sort of 33 up past 70 worldwide, incomes doubling and tripling just in the last few decades worldwide, more people educated than ever before, you know, lower rates of war and violence. What lies behind pretty much all of that is closer global connectivity and you know, people coming together to create things. And last year yanked that away from us. And I think, you know, if you look beyond the sort of immediate cost in terms of health, that is the biggest and most tragic thing about the last year.
Dr. Christakis.
Sorry, just staying on a positive note,
yes.
Also, it means that we understand the importance of working together as a global community in order to confront these threats, because now we understand how terrible they are, I hope.
I hope, yes. Dr. Christakis, 3 minutes. How has it changed us?
I mean, I don't have much to add to that. Of course, in the book, I talk about, I mean, I think, first of all, you have to define the time horizon, you know, what's happening in the next 1, 2, 3, 4 years, and what's happening long term. Long term, I don't think it's going to have changed us very much at all. Just like Charles said, I think during times of plague, people flee the cities. They will return. They always return. I think there's been a kind of a cessation in the progress in globalization, but I think the economic arguments in favor of globalizations are so compelling. There'll be some onshoring now, but that will also eventually reverse. In the short term, it's had all the kinds of effects that Charles is mentioning, plus some others. I mean, I think there's a way in which plagues are technological and social accelerators. So on the relationship front, you know, if you were about to get married during times of plague, people get married, and if you're about to get divorced during times of plague, it increases, you know, let's get it over with kind of thing. So you know, there's and they accelerate technologies. I mean, Zoom technology existed before the plague, but it's been accelerated. mRNA vaccine technology existed before the plague, but it's been accelerated. Robotic, you know, drone delivery technology existed before the plague, but it's been accelerated. So there are a variety of ways in which over the short term, there will be some changes in our society, in education, in real estate, in, you know, if people work from home, for example, it's going to reshape the real estate market in certain interesting ways. In terms of some of these other technologies that I mentioned. So just I guess to sum up, long term, I don't think there are going to be radical changes. Short term, there are going to be a number of them in various parts of our economy and social life.
All right, so Patty and Janet, you had questions. We won't have time to get to and answer. So I would like to tell you that both of these gentlemen are on Twitter, so you can tweet at them. You can look for their handles at my Twitter page, which is at Petrie, because I don't know your handles off the top of my head, but you could find them there, or you could just share your handles, or however else people can ask you questions. Do either of you have ways to have people get in touch with you?
I think we're both fairly, if you Google us, ways to contact us pop up.
All right, great, fantastic. Thank you both so much for your time. This was a fantastic, extremely interesting conversation. You've both written extremely interesting books. One more time, Nowhere Bookshop is where you can get copies for yourself. Thank you, gentlemen, both of you. Let me say the titles one more time. It is Apollo's Arrow, The Profound and Enduring Impact of Coronavirus on the Way We Live by Nicholas Christakis, and The Plague Cycle, The Unending War Between Humanity and Infectious Disease by Charles Kenning. Thank you both so much.
Thank you.
Thank you
so much. Have a great day, everyone. Thanks for coming to the San Antonio Book Festival. Have a great afternoon. Bye-bye.